Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 309. This week the questions are taken from Guide 385 to USS Pennsylvania of 1837 and the second video on Johnny Walker covering his service on Stork up to the commissioning of HMS Starling. So let's get on with the question, shall we, in this new month. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, had the US actually completed and retained those previous ships of the line up to the War of 1812, how would they have affected the Royal Navy's efforts? Well, I think you've got two groups that you have to evaluate separately. First, you've got a group of 3 ships of the line that were supposed to be built commensurate with the American War of Independence, and shortly thereafter, of which USS America that was donated to the French was one. Based on America itself, I don't think those ships realistically are going to be around by the War of 1812. I mean, they'll be 30 years old, so they're approaching the first point in a ship of the line's lifetime where you have to decide, are we getting rid of this, breaking it up, or are we giving it a fairly major overhaul? And when you look at the America, not only was it not particularly large, it was also somewhat underarmed. Its main armament was 18-pounder guns as opposed to 24-pounders, which you would typically look for in a third rate. And on top of that, it was built in haste with partially unseasoned wood and ended up dry rotting, so it didn't have a very long lifespan. So given that the other two are going to be constructed under similar circumstances, I think the best result for those is probably going to be at some point they're razzed down to large frigates, maybe at some point in the early 1800s. And even then, you know, they're going to be 18-pounder frigates. Maybe you could rearm them with 24-pounders, but if you could do that, you probably would have done so in the first place, although, you know, maybe taking off the upper deck and the guns up there might save enough weight to give you 24-pounders on the lower deck, who knows. But that's being really generous. I think realistically, given their issues, they probably would have rotted out 10, 15 years before 1812. But then you've got the other 6. Now, those were authorised right at the end of the 1700s, and they're supposed to be not less than 74 guns, so essentially probably 74 gun third rates. 6 of them planned, probably would have been entering service early to mid part of the 1800s, 1803 to 1805. So by 1812 they would still be relatively new. In theory, I mean, there's not a huge amount of detail available about what they would have been, but, you know, in theory, let's assume they're fairly standard 74s. And by this time, the standard armament of a 74 is 32-pounder guns on its low deck. You know, back in the American War of Independence, as I said, you could find 24-pounder main armament third rates, but whatever. So you've got 6 32-pounder armed 74-gun ships of the line. That's a reasonably decent force for the time period. The next 2 variables are going to be, what condition are they in? Because just because they built them doesn't necessarily mean they'll be ready for active service. Knowing how little money the US Navy got during most of the 1800s, it's entirely possible they'll be up on the stocks and need a while to be brought back into service. Or, you know, is this some magical alternate timeline where the US Navy actually gets funding from Congress and they're all ready to go? So that's going to make a fairly big difference, because if they are ready to go when the war breaks out, the Royal Navy is going to have to take stock and go, okay, right, we actually have to send a fairly substantial number of ships of the line, third rates of their own, maybe a second rate or 2 as flagship, to make sure that our blockading forces are safe. But if they're going to take a while to recommission because they're up on the stocks, then the Royal Navy can start out with a frigate blockade and then look at peeling off third rates to reinforce on a somewhat more leisurely basis. And the other issue that you've got to factor in, apart from their readiness, is where are they? You know, are they scattered across various US East Coast ports, or are they concentrated in one or two locations to form fairly powerful squadrons? Because again, this is going to affect what the Royal Navy is going to do, because if you have a handful of frigates and a handful of ships of the line scattered all up and down the coast, then the Royal Navy is going to be looking at, okay, well, let's put a ship of the line or two on each blockading squadron outside each port where these ships are. Now, that obviously complicates matters because you've got to have other ships of the line ready to relieve those ships of the line. So if you've got 6 third rates in 6 ports, that means the Royal Navy has to commit probably at least a couple of dozen, 16 to 24 third rates to be happy with their counter, because they're going to want at least one, ideally 2 ships on blockade duty at any one time, and at least 1, possibly 2 backups at any given time. So that actually forces them to commit quite a large number of third rates, which could again slow down their overall deployment. The flip side is that if they're concentrated in 1 or 2 places, so there's either all 6 or maybe 3 and 3, in some ways that actually decomplicates things for the Royal Navy, because if they're all in one place, let's say there's 6 of them, then the Royal Navy can probably get away with only, quote unquote, deploying a dozen capital ships, because they can have a blockade of 6 to 8 and 4 to 6 in reserve in harbour on rotation, which is, maybe half as much as they'd need if they were scattered everywhere. And obviously if you've got 3 and 3 or something, the balance is somewhere between those two. But the Royal Navy is not exactly short on ships of the line, but it would massively increase the expense, complexity, and flag rank of the initial deployments in 1812 and 1813. And it would also make things very interesting in terms of frigates, because historically speaking, once the Royal Navy blockade really got going, there was a big problem for the US frigates, because obviously they had to either try and sneak out, which was difficult, or wait for weather to clear the way. So it limited their ability to sail. Whereas if you have third rates available, then potentially, depending on how many you've got in the port, you could try and force the blockade. You wouldn't necessarily be looking at winning, but if, let's say, you have a couple of third rates in a port and the Royal Navy has a couple of third rates and some frigates on blockade duty, then if you sail your 2 third rates, or at least you look like you're going to, so you head in one, let's say you head southeast, the Royal Navy has to go and match that, because letting a couple of ships of the line loose in the high seas is not a good plan. So pretty much the entire Royal Navy blockade force has to move to match your sailing. And then that means that a frigate, even a big one, that is also hiding in the port can go, okay, right, thanks for distracting everyone. I'm going to go off northeast. And pretty much therefore you can almost at will release frigates into the wild, unless the Royal Navy massively increases their blockading force. And then, of course, whether or not you want to accept battle is entirely down to you. You can just, in theory, as long as you don't have a completely contrary wind, the US ships line could just turn around and go back to port. And there's not a huge amount the Royal Navy could do about it. Although, obviously, that is a high-risk, high-reward strategy, because you could get contrary winds that suddenly prevent you from going back into port and would force you to fight. And the Royal Navy does have past record on how it deals with small groups of enemy ships of the line in various ports, and one of their favourite tactics is to present a blockading force that it looks like you might be able to fight, but then way over the horizon you have a bunch more ships. So worst case scenario at that point, you could have a couple of ships of the line third rates deploy. The wind shifts to an extent that they can't really get back into port, and then it turns out that yes, there were a couple of third rates and let's say 3 frigates on the blockade. Turns out there are another couple of third rates and a couple more frigates 50 miles over the horizon, and then they show up and now you're outnumbered 2 to 1, and that ends badly. But that's war. It's a risk. BK Zhong asks, in general, how long would it take to build or upgrade a capital ship-sized Drydock? Unfortunately, there is no easy answer to this question because there's far too many variables to consider. So if you look at Pearl Harbor, for example, the US was able to add additional dry docks to Pearl Harbor in the beginning of their involvement in World War II on a basis of roughly 8 to 12 months, depending on the specific dock. Some took a bit longer, one or two, especially one or two that had already been started, took a bit shorter. But to give you some idea of the variables you've got to look at, firstly, of course, what era are you in? Because a dry dock to fit a first-rate ship of the line versus a dry dock to fit an ironclad versus a dry dock to fit a dreadnought versus a dry dock to fit a dreadnought versus a dry dock to fit a fast battleship are all very, very different sizes. And that is going to have a huge impact on how long it takes you to build them. Then, obviously, if you're upgrading, is there infrastructure to move, like cranes and buildings and railway lines and so forth? But even that aside, assuming you're digging it new, you've then got to look at the type of dry dock you're building and what the terrain is. So when I say type of dry dock, you can get dry docks that are stepped, almost like Roman amphitheatres, and we've probably seen plenty of examples of those, or you can get the slightly more conventional, at least to our eyes, although it is a somewhat newer innovation, just rectangular profile dry dock like this one you see in the picture. The stepped one is slightly easier to do, but can involve a little bit more material removal. And then, of course, it also depends on, are you doing this by hand labour or by machine labour or by a mixture of both? It just depends how steep the steps you want on your amphitheatre-style dry dock are. And then I mentioned the terrain, because if you are digging into something relatively soft, like soil, I mean, hopefully you shouldn't be building a dry dock in soil, but let's say you are, maybe it's really heavy clay soil or something, or soft stone, that, of course, will be much, much easier to dig, and therefore quicker, but it's also not going to be watertight in and of itself, most likely. So you're going to have to introduce quite significant lining to that dry dock, whether that be concrete or mortared stone or some other form. But that's obviously going to increase the work. So you dig the actual hole in the ground quicker, but then you have to stabilize it and line it, which extends the build time. Versus if you're digging it into non-porous rock, that tends to take a lot longer because it's a lot tougher a job, but generally speaking, you don't have to worry so much about lining the thing. And as a result, you know, if you take a low end and you go, right, we've got as much machine tools and explosives as we possibly could need, and the ground is mostly waterproof, and we're building it for a relatively small capital ship, say let's say a dreadnought-sized vessel, relative to something like an Iowa, you might be able to get a brand new basic dry dock done in 6 to 8 months from groundbreaking. Whereas if you've got, I don't know, a granite dry dock that you need to make 1,000 feet long to fit aircraft carriers and Iowa-class battleships, and you've got to move a bunch of infrastructure around because you're building it in a pre-existing port, and this is going to just be another new dry dock, and perhaps it's wartime, so the heavy excavation equipment is needed elsewhere, so you've only got minimal mechanical assistance and mostly human work, and the workers are needed elsewhere in the yard as well, so you can't even do double shifts. That might take you 2 or 3 years. Captain Vladimir asks, in Norman Friedman's book on British destroyers and frigates during and after World War II, he mentions the Royal Navy didn't have much wartime success with proximity fuses. Is this accurate, and if so, what problems did the Brits have with them that the US Navy didn't? Was it an issue with the fuses, the shells, the gun mounts, or something else? So the section in question is at the end of a bit describing fire control in World War II destroyers and their war experience. And it says, another important wartime development was electric remote fuse setting, which greatly reduced the system dead time between calculation and fuse setting at the gun. On the other hand, the proximity fuse, so important for the wartime US Navy, seems not to have been very successful in wartime British service. In 1945, the British Pacific Fleet commander reported that proximity fuses had shot down only one aircraft, one of his own Seafires. So I did a little bit more digging because this does seem to run at odds with some elements of the British Pacific Fleet's experience, as well as the British home defence anti-aircraft guns experience. They did very well with proximity fuses against V1 flying bombs, and out in the Pacific, as you know, I've mentioned on the channel before, they had a certain degree of success using the extended range of the 5.25-inch gun to snipe away at Japanese aircraft that were hovering beyond what they thought was a safe distance, i.e. beyond 5-inch 38 range. And that necessitated the use of proximity fuses, because radar fire control is good. Radar fire control in 1945 isn't. We can get a skin kill on an aircraft that's 14, 15,000 feet away, by design at least. Sheer luck maybe. In any case, what I think this reflects, doing a bit more digging into the nature of British proximity fuses, because bear in mind Britain actually did most of the invention work for the proximity fuse, and then, as with a number of things in World War II, the Americans took the design and mass manufactured it, but there were specifically British designed fuses for use in British guns. And what it seems to be, at least I think, is that British fuses, at least the early versions of British proximity fuses, had a number of issues with the actual mechanism failing. Not because the mechanism itself was faulty, as in, the radar unit. The problem, in fact, was that they were set into the cap of the shell using wax and solder, depending on which bit of component you're looking at. And what was happening was that in London, in the UK, this was fine because it was relatively cool. In the Pacific, however, and they only experienced this once they got to the Pacific, the wax tended to get a bit soft while it was in storage, and then the wax wasn't providing enough support for the mechanism, and it was getting disjointed, falling over, getting rattled around, or otherwise made inoperable. And similarly, the solder, as it turned out, was vulnerable to air friction heating and would liquefy or soften. So essentially the materials supporting the fusing were going soft or liquid, and the fuse was therefore either setting off early or being rendered inoperable. This was then solved, and basically using the same stuff that the Americans were using, and or in some cases by just slapping an extra protective ablative wax coating over the top of the shell. But obviously that took time. So I suspect what is happening in the section that Norman Friedman's describing in that particular report is this is reflecting the early use of proximity shells by the British before they've managed to identify and fix all those problems. And by the time all of that is identified and fixed, it's obviously right towards the very end of the Second World War. Unemployed history major asks, had the Confederacy captured Pennsylvania intact, do you think they'd have used it to break the Union blockade once it was implemented, or attempt to curry favour with England by selling it or exchanging it for goods, or something else? I think it definitely would have been something of a race, because Pennsylvania was not in ready-to-go condition when she was burned. That was part of the reason why she was burned. So if the Confederates captured her intact, so essentially we're presupposing that the burning of the Navy Yard either doesn't happen or doesn't happen particularly well, they've got to get her back into service. So they've got to take her out of ordinary and equip her, which shouldn't necessarily be too much of a problem, but it does take time. The slightly bigger issue is they're going to have to find people to sail her. Now, obviously, the Confederate Navy did have a fair number of people in it, but for the most part, their ships usually didn't have more than 100 people apiece because they were relatively small. Obviously, there were one or two exceptions there. To fully man a ship like Pennsylvania would require a very significant investment in manpower, and of course that also comes with a commensurate risk, because if you lose the ship, either to boarding or to shell fire, then potentially you've lost a lot of people as well. And that's going to be another matter to consider, because yes, she is very powerful, she carries a lot of guns. When she was built, most people were thinking in terms of solid shot. Some of the more recently built Union frigates with lots of shell guns would pose a legitimate threat to Pennsylvania. But, of course, if they've captured the Navy Yard intact as well, that means they can probably rearm her with more shell guns and fewer 32-pounders. So let's assume an optimal outcome for the Confederacy. They've got the men to crew her, they've managed to get her into service in a pretty quick state, and they've armed her with a lot of shell guns as well as a few solid shotguns. What would they use her for? They're not going to bother sailing her across the Atlantic and try and trade her in or something. They are going to try and use her to break the blockade, and initially she'd probably be fairly good at it because she just has overwhelming firepower, so if anything gets caught by her, they're pretty much dead. The two problems that she's going to face is, one, a number of the more recent Union ships have steam auxiliary power, so they can sail away from her in directions that she can't really track them down and hunt them down in, which could pose a maneuverability issue. And secondly, of course, there's a lot more Union ships, so while she might be able to quite easily dispatch any one, especially if you've got steam-powered frigates, you could end up with death by 1,000 cuts from a whole pack of Union vessels. So she'd have to be used fairly sparingly. And then, of course, you've got the fact that the Union is going to be building ironclads sooner or later, so you have a very narrow window before one or more Union ironclads show up, and then at that point, ironically enough, if you have armed her with a bunch of shell guns, you've pretty much neutered her ability to counter the ironclads unless she just rams one of them. Sharkman asks, throughout your videos there seems to be a centuries-long continuous thread that the nebulous Admiralty manages to conspire to make the worst possible decisions for admirals at sea. What actually is the Admiralty, both in British and non-British contexts, if applicable, and what is its role in governing the Navy? Is it composed of a bunch of pencil-pusher politicians who never commanded a ship, as some decisions suggest? And is it as incompetent as it seems from your videos, or is it a matter of good decisions going unmentioned? This is a very complex subject, so whilst there are admiralties for basically every major navy, I'm going to confine pretty much most of my comments to the British Admiralty for this question, because, answering this in full would be a Wednesday video in and of itself just for the British Admiralty, let alone everyone else. So, the Admiralty, in a British context, is essentially the upper echelons of the command of the navies, and more specifically, for the majority of the period of the Royal Navy, it's the ashore at home part, because obviously you can have admirals at sea, but the Admiralty, well, at one point the Admiralty was quite literally a building, obviously full of people, but shorthand you can refer to it as the upper echelons logistics design and support section of the Navy. And as such, ultimately they are in charge of the Navy, with the exception that for the majority of the period that Channel covers, in fact for the majority of the period of the history of the Royal Navy, you have the Sea Lords, third, second and first Sea Lord being the senior most Royal Navy officer, but then you also have the First Lord of the Admiralty, which is different from the First Sea Lord. The First Lord of the Admiralty, especially by the end of the period that the Channel covers, is a political appointee from the government of the time. So, but this is obviously back before there was a Ministry of Defence. The Admiralty was its own separate thing, and so the First Lord of the Admiralty was essentially kind of like, if you were in the US, the Secretary of Defence or the Minister of Defence in the UK, but specifically for the Navy. So the Secretary of the Navy in the US might be an analogous position, but that position still exists as far as I'm aware. Whereas the First Lord of the Admiralty was, if anything, probably a somewhat more serious position in government to hold than the guy who was in charge of the land forces. Now, the two problems that very often come up with the British Admiralty in a lot of the time period that we're covering on this channel, not the entire time period, because as with the Royal Navy in general, the fortunes of the Admiralty in terms of competence wax and wane, but one of the significant issues was that, yes, you did have people who had minimal sea service and mostly admin service, and obviously they tend to be somewhat disconnected from the frontline needs of the service. Plus, you have a symbiotic-parasitic relationship with the Treasury, and the Treasury is the mortal enemy of any sane defense organization, be it Navy, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of War, whatever. And a lot of Treasury decisions get routed through the Admiralty, i.e., you get told you have X to spend, and then the Admiralty has to decide how to spend it. And in the older periods of the time the channel covers, so maybe up to the middle of the 1700s, there's a huge amount of corruption. That's not to say there isn't corruption after, and that's not to say there aren't drives to remove corruption before, but broadly speaking, there is a huge amount of corruption and nepotism going on, which means things just don't function. And this is usually highlighted when you look at periods when they do try and clear out the dross, and you just look at the absolutely colossal list of corrupt items, expenditures, money going missing, supplies going missing, poor quality supplies being issued, etc. Decisions made on how much they can skim off the top rather than what's good for the Navy. When all of that's being cleared out, that gives you an idea of how bad it actually was at various points. And then as time goes on, as direct corruption becomes somewhat less of an issue, you get superannuation, especially in times of peace, such as there are in the 18th century for the Royal Navy, where basically the senior officers, i.e. the ones who are most likely to populate the Admiralty, are just there essentially until they die, which means they can very quickly drift away from having any real grasp of what it's like to be a frontline naval officer. And this especially becomes more and more of a problem as time goes on, because the pace of technological change continues to accelerate. So by the time you get to the 1840s and the 1850s, you get late 60s, early 70s, even late 70s, early 80s age admirals. And once you've poked them awake with a stick and asked them, well, what do you think about supplying our new warships with purpose-designed steam boilers for engines, they're like, well, back in my day, we didn't need such things. So, yes, Grandpa, your day was shortly after the death of the dinosaurs. Please stop. And quite often, some of those officers hadn't seen sea service since the Napoleonic Wars. And, of course, this being the early 19th century, the diagnoses for things like dementia and Alzheimer's as well weren't necessarily all that advanced. And then, of course, you get the odd person like Cochrane, who is in his 70s when the Crimean War kicks off, and when they ask him, well, what would you do if you command a fleet? He's just like, I will commit every war crime imaginable. In fact, I will invent some new ones. War crime speedrun. And even when they're not, literal old age pensioners, as again you go forward into the latter part of the 19th and early 20th centuries, you still get people who are wedded to very old ideas about how tactics could work. And unfortunately, by the early 20th century, a very old idea about how tactics and warfare works could be, an idea that's only 10 to 15 years old. And so you get really dumb decisions like the Royal Navy getting voice radio on their ships in the 1920s and then having it taken away again because someone at the Admiralty decides they didn't like it. Not because it wasn't effective, but because they were wedded to the idea that everything should be written down, because that's how they did it back on my day when we were still hoisting the sails. And because you'd need to be an exceptionally fast note taker to scribble down absolutely everything that a Royal Navy officer could and probably would say over voice radio, their solution was to take the voice radios away, setting back Royal Navy communications by a couple of decades. Now, with all that doom and gloom, as you know, the Admiralty doesn't just make poor decisions. It was ultimately the Admiralty that signed off on HMS Dreadnought. It was ultimately the Admiralty that signed off on the Queen Elizabeth class, and any number of other decisions like Warrior and so forth. But for an organisation that is supposed to be in charge of and running the Navy for the benefit of the nation, for a very long time period, again, as mentioned, with ups and downs, the Admiralty did make some rather notable and rather catastrophic decisions, or at least branches of it did, which they really, really shouldn't have if they were operating as they were supposed to. Caluma1998 asks, "Hi Drac, I hope you might be able to help. I desperately want to know more about the French Navy in World War II before the Armistice, but all my searches bring up either Mers el-Kebir or Toulon. I know lots of ship information is out there, but I can't find any information about tactics or organisation. How did the French plan to fight the war, and what were their goals and structure?" If you want a handy go-to reference to start from, and then obviously you can develop your reading from there, unfortunately there's a lot more in French than there is in English, but in English I would probably recommend The French Navy in World War II by Rear Admiral Paul Alphan, I think that's how it's pronounced, Auphan, and Jacques Mordal, Mordal, published by USNI. That, as the name suggests, covers the entire French Navy history in the Second World War, but a good third of it covers the opening segment before Mers el-Kebir. So, very broadly speaking, the French had obviously multiple scenarios that they planned for fighting the Second World War or some conflict in 1940-ish. And some of those involve them fighting alone against the Italians, and obviously you have the historical Second World War, which started off initially against Germany, and to be honest, for the majority of the time, if not all the time that the French are actually fighting, it pretty much just is Germany. Italy only gets involved at the very last minute, as France is pretty much on its knees. And the plan, as was worked out with the Royal Navy, was that the French, the Marine Nationale, would assist in securing the Mediterranean. And exactly what balance of forces would be there obviously would depend on the scenario. And as it turned out, during most of the time period, obviously, as we said, Italy wasn't involved, so that force was gradually drawn down on, but there was still a French presence in the Mediterranean. So the Mediterranean was supposed to be a cooperative theatre, but with the French taking more and more of a lead if the Royal Navy had to draw off its forces elsewhere to an area where the Royal Navy was the primary force. Then you have the Atlantic, and obviously the French guarding their own coasts as well, but out in the Atlantic you had two main elements of French naval cooperation. One was, of course, cooperation with convoy escorts where they could, but the other one was the Force de Raid. I think that's how it's pronounced. It's literally spelled Force de Raid, but I'm pretty sure that's not how it's pronounced in French. And actually, that force was substantially, not entirely, but substantially what was present at Mers el-Kebir, because its centerpieces were Dunkirk and Strasbourg, and for very, very good reason. They were exceptionally fast, well-armed, and pretty powerful units, and as I've pointed out many times in the past, Strasbourg was capable of going toe-to-toe with anything in the German Navy at the time and demolishing almost everything pretty much out of hand. Or the only thing she'd have any struggles with is the Scharnhorsts, and even then, I think Strasbourg probably would have the upper hand against a Scharnhorst. Dunkirk is almost in the same boat, except that, both of them are going to absolutely monster a Hipper class or a Deutschland, but I would say a Scharnhorst probably has a slight advantage over Dunkirk, whereas Strasbourg has an advantage over the Scharnhorst. And this essentially is a fast force. Fast destroyers, fast cruisers, fast capital ships designed to help hunt down and destroy German raiders. And indeed, both, though the entire force was involved in the hunt for Graf Spee, for example. And so the Mediterranean and the Atlantic would be the primary focuses of French naval strategy. There would be a small element of the Marine Nationale in the Channel, but that was largely a Royal Navy responsibility. As you can kind of see when the Dunkirk evacuation occurs, there are French ships there, but the majority are British. And there would also be expeditionary forces where the French were supporting Allied war efforts. So, for example, during the Norwegian campaign, there is a French contingent of troops, and therefore there's a French naval presence as well. So, if you want to narrow it down into very, very basic, it's the French Navy would support French troop contingents when and where they were dispatched. It would maintain a minimal presence in the Channel, but primarily the British would be in charge of dealing with stuff there, and primary French efforts would be in securing the Mediterranean and helping in secure the Atlantic as well. Obviously, all of this is prior to Italy's involvement in the war and prior to things like Bismarck coming online, but equally prior to Richelieu and Jean Bart coming online, which all of these things, if France was still in the war, would have significantly changed their tactics and the way the French fleet was organised. Mike Lima 77 asks, in a previous Drydock you discussed how different nations may have different standards when classifying subclasses or separate classes, especially with changes in armament and structure. Could it be argued that the South Dakota was a subclass from her three sisters, given the changes made to act as a flagship? And similarly, could Edinburgh and Belfast be considered as a separate class from the rest of the towns? I don't think you could argue South Dakota is a subclass, to be perfectly honest, because I don't think the changes made are substantial enough. I mean, yes, she does lose a couple of her secondary mounts, and obviously, yes, her superstructure is very slightly different, but similar modifications were made in the Iowa class. One of them was fitted as a flagship, and the other three are very slightly different, although obviously having more space to play with, they didn't lose a pair of twin 5-inch 38 mounts. But, spoiler alert, if you look at the bridges of the Iowa class, you will notice one of them is a level higher than the others. And my reasoning is essentially they started with the same base design. So South Dakota and her three sisters and the four Iowas, they all started with the same approved design, and then someone went, right, we're just going to make a couple of tweaks here to include flag facilities, but substantially, belt armor, displacement, main battery, speed, etc., they're all pretty much the same. In fact, obviously, most of those things are absolutely identical, with the exception of displacement, which varies from ship to ship anyway, within reasonable margins. However, when it comes to Belfast and Edinburgh, they are very definitely a subclass, because they're slightly larger, they have a different machinery layout, they have a slightly different main armament layout. X and Y turrets are elevated one deck. They have an additional pair of anti-aircraft guns, twin 4-inch mounts. There's a whole slew of other changes, and as a result, obviously, they displace more as well. Now, the only reason I would hesitate on separating them out as a separate class is because they are part of a continuous production run. They do share a similar naming convention, and they do make up a minority of overall town class built. And again, the description of Edinburgh and Belfast, despite all those changes I indicated, the difference between them and the previous town that was built are still nowhere near as significant as the differences between some of the Admiral Hipper class, and we still call them the Admiral Hipper class. However, whilst I think it's safe to say the Edinburgh subclass is a safe designation, I think had the war not occurred, or had the war occurred a few years later, in other words, for whatever reason, more town class to the Edinburgh specification had been constructed, at that point, I think you could be justified in calling them a separate class. So if they'd built 4 or 5 Edinburgh-type cruisers, I think at that point there are enough differences between the Edinburghs and the towns to say, actually, this is a follow-on class to the previous one, as opposed to just part of the town class run. Runon asks, what are your top 3 inventions from the common British back garden shed? There's so many to choose from, but in terms of naval-related inventions that started off in a garden shed, well, for one thing, the bouncing bomb, obviously used against the Mona and Ida and Sorp dams, although that's an RAF thing, but then later obviously you have highball as well. That started off with Barnes Wallis having fun with marbles in water tanks in his garden and in his shed. A whole range of fuses for things like large mines and such like, which is one of the reasons Campbelltown is here, were originally invented by a couple of chaps literally in a garden shed going, gobstoppers dissolve at a constant rate in liquid. And a lot of the early prototypes were quite literally that. And probably also just for the sheer spectacular level of impact it's had on the world as we know it even up to this day, the jet engine, or at least the one that is kind of the continuous line of development up until now, the Frank Whittle jet engine, that was assembled in a shed by him and tested and made to work. You got all sorts of other fun things like hovercraft and so forth, also invented by British inventors in their garden sheds. A.B. Coates asks, people often describe ships in terms of the speed, protection, firepower triangle. Are there any examples that took one of those aspects to the absolute limit at the expense of the other two, and how well did they do? There are a surprising number of examples of this kind of thing. However, unfortunately, a good chunk of them never actually saw combat. So, for example, you have the Italia here. It had speed, it had firepower, and it had basically no protection as far as conventional battleship protection went. It did have quite a lot of subdivision, but that was really about it. So Italia definitely just skimps on the protection in favour of the firepower and the speed, but never actually saw combat. Ships that basically went all in on just the one thing were monitors, the 20th century version thereof, because most of them are either floating cruiser or battleship guns on hulls more commensurate with very small cruisers or destroyers in terms of displacement, if not shape. Now, granted, yes, they do tend to have a bunch of protection against torpedoes, some of the large ones with massive blisters, but in terms of resisting incoming shell fire or going anywhere fast, they're usually pretty hopeless. Now, we do actually know how well they might perform in a straight-up battle, thanks to the Battle of Imbros in World War I, where the ex-Goeben showed up and took on, amongst other things, some monitors. Spoiler alert, the monitors lost quite spectacularly, even though they had, in theory, the heavier guns. They didn't have as many of them, and without the speed and the protection, the ex-Goeben, now Yevot Selim, was able to put one of them down pretty quickly. You could make a tangential argument that destroyers in general are an example of firepower and speed at the expense of protection. And you could also suppose a look also at various landing craft that was converted into support craft. So, landing craft with massive banks of rocket batteries attached, the landing craft gun series. So, obviously, for their class, their speed is pretty much the same, but they really go all in on the firepower, but really do not have all that much protection. And they tend to be very, very effective as long as they're shooting at things that can't hit them back or miss a lot. The minute they do get hit, well, unsurprisingly, it doesn't tend to go very well for them. Patrick Donnelly asks, Jon Parshall has said that had Mitscher not sent Hornet's air group off on the flight to nowhere, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu and Soryu could have been wiped out all in one go. Had this happened, how would the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy go forward for the rest of the battle? That's certainly perfectly possible. 2 carrier dive bombing groups managed to take out 3 of the Japanese carriers, so 1 additional group should be more than enough to take care of the 1 remaining carrier. Now, that does lead to a bunch of interesting follow-ons, because if the Japanese have lost all their aircraft carriers in the first round, if you like, then of course they're not in a position to send off that counterstrike that takes out Yorktown. If they're not in a position to do that, then obviously Yorktown survives. And you now have 3 US carriers, probably minus their torpedo squadrons, who are now able, instead of having to organise a counterstrike against Hiryu, they're now free to go after the rest of the Japanese forces. So we see in the historical Battle of Midway the surviving American carriers harrying the Japanese forces as they withdraw. If the Japanese have lost all their carriers completely out of the blue, there's a fairly good chance they're going to withdraw because, given the estimates they thought the Americans had at Midway with the historical outcome, an even worse outcome, they're going to assume the Americans have actually even more aircraft and aircraft carriers present. So there would probably be an earlier Japanese withdrawal, a second full follow-up strike during the first day, which is probably going to grab a bunch of the Japanese escort vessels for the carriers, because obviously there's no carriers for them to escort anymore. The bigger question, I think, is what happens at night, because we know that historically the US carriers withdraw because there's a danger of being pursued by Japanese surface forces. If the Japanese turn around and book it to the west earlier in the day, then perhaps they don't do that withdrawal, which gives them an even greater opportunity to continue follow-up attacks the following day, and perhaps even finding and taking out ships in the Japanese landing formation, which was trailing behind the carriers. Alternatively, you could have a scenario where, free from having to escort the carriers, because they're now all on fire and sinking, the Japanese surface escorts may decide that, that they failed their task so spectacularly, the only way to make retribution is a death or glory ride straight at where they think the American carriers are coming from, which could go one of two ways, because of course they've got a lot more time during the day to make that journey and get up to speed. So it would depend on how quickly those were spotted. The American formation does have the speed to get away from that attack if they spot it in time, but also if they, in an optimal scenario, if they spot it early enough in the day, then that second follow-up strike that historically was sent after the one surviving Japanese carrier could be sent after the charging Japanese surface vessels, which could result in even more losses for the Japanese Navy, because then when they eventually turn back, even if the US Navy withdraws overnight just to be on the safe side, having gotten even closer to the American positions than they did historically, they have further to run, which means they can be harried more and more. Brian Smith asks, are there any specific reasons that the European navies seem to focus on what seem to be odd sizes, 13 and 15 inch, and the US Navy and Imperial Japanese Navy seem to focus on gun sizes that were even in number, 14, 16 and 18 inch? There both is and isn't specific reasons. So there's not a specific reason for those particular increments, as in, is there some kind of holy formula that dictates this? But there are some rules of thumb and general circumstances that sort of led to this. So most everyone, except the Germans, seem to have gone with 12-inch as the standard battleship gun in the latter pre-Dreadnought period, and a lot of them even in the early pre-Dreadnought period. Which means that when you go into the Dreadnought era, everyone, again except for the Germans, are building 12-inch gun Dreadnoughts as their first attempts, and some of their follow-ons as well. Now, when it comes time to upgrade, you face a little bit of a dilemma, because if you upgrade the size of the gun, you're making handling more difficult, which means your equipment is going to be bigger and heavier because it has to be hauling heavier shells and charges, which also means it's going to be more expensive in and of itself, and the ship is going to be more expensive because the gun turrets and barbettes and all of this have to expand. And in return, what you're getting is a gradual increase in armor penetration and theoretically range. And also, sometimes expressed as broadside weight, how much actual metal and explosive is flying down range. But those things do not scale all together. So if you upgrade, for example, from a 12-inch to a 13-inch gun, you do get a bit more penetration. This is true, and the shell can carry slightly more explosive. But overall, if you go from 12 to 13-inch, you're probably going to have to drop a turret or make your ship much, much larger. And your increase in broadside weight, of, let's say, 8 13-inch guns versus 10 12-inch guns, or 10 13-inch guns versus 12 12-inch guns, you might not actually be getting that much, if anything, of an overall increase in broadside weight. And the other changes in range and penetration might not be large enough to really justify all the extra expense. Whereas it seems that, broadly speaking, if you added 1.5 inches to the 12-inch, so you got 13.5 inch, or in the French case 13.4 inch, and a couple of others as well, that little bit of extra dimension, it didn't add a colossal amount to the overall weight of the gun and the space it took up compared to a 13-inch, but it did increase the weight of the shell so that you actually got a substantial increase in broadside weight, even if you were losing, say, 2 guns overall. and the increases in penetration and range and explosive delivery were also pretty substantial, so suddenly it became worth it. Now, obviously, the same thing would apply to going to an even bigger caliber, but it's risk versus reward or cost effectiveness. You know, if you go with a 13.5-inch gun, let's say if you're the British, this offers you some fairly substantial benefits at a certain price of upgrade. If you go to an even bigger gun, you're having to pay even more. And is that upgrade that you'll get hopefully further still, is that actually worthwhile? You know, do you want to skip straight to a 16, 17 or 18-inch gun? Because yes, you'll have fantastic penetration and ridiculous range, but can your fire control systems keep up with it? Are you really going to get away with only having 2 or 4 guns on your ship, or are you going to build an absolutely monstrous, ridiculously cost-prohibitive vessel, etc., etc., etc.? So that kind of explains why you end up going with the 13.4-13.5 in a lot of European navies. Of course, the Germans, again, being the exception, going from 11 to 12, but never mind. But then when you're the Americans or the Japanese, you are slightly behind the British in terms of who's building biggest guns, because obviously the British deploy the Orions first, much as everyone in Europe is as well. But in Europe, they're just like, oh, okay, we'll vaguely match them either in either by having more guns or similar size guns. But being the US Navy or the Japanese, you're not in quite as close and contentious an arms race, because you do have that distance of oceans. So you can then turn around and go, okay, we can do gun upgrades, but why not go just that little bit bigger? So, you know, if we're being forced to shift off the 12-inch gun, we can get that just fraction larger gun, which would mean our guns are just so fractionally better because we've got the time. And you see this with the 14-inch guns, say the US ones. They start development about a year after the 13.5s. They know the 13.5s are coming in, so when they deploy the 14-inch gun a couple of years after the British deploy the 13.5, it's broadly similar in firepower, but they can say we've got the slightly bigger gun. And then when upgrades take place, again, for the British going from 13.5 to 15-inch, it's another 1.5-inch increment. Pretty much all the arguments for going from 12 to 13.5 apply for 13.5 to 15. And then you see, you know, the Italians with the Caracciolo and the Germans with the Bayerns and so forth, all going, yep, okay, we'll match that. And the French going, well, we're going to match that with just lots of our previous gun. And pretty much the same thing happening in the US and Japan, going, well, okay, everyone is going for 15-inch, well, with a little bit more considerate time over here, not being involved directly as much as the European powers are in the massive First World War, we can just go, okay, we're going to have 16-inch guns. And then you might be thinking, aha, but logically then for the European powers, they should then go to the 16.5-inch gun. Well, spectacularly enough, that's what the European powers were looking at. The L-20E Alphas were supposed to have guns of about that caliber, and the British looked very seriously at 16.5-inch guns before they decided actually they were going to skip that increment entirely and go straight to 18-inch, which is of course 1.5 inches bigger than 16.5. And then when they were forced to scale it back, one of the first things they looked at with the battle cruisers that would eventually become the G3s was coming down from 18 to 16.5, and then they dropped it down to 16 again for economic reasons, getting them all to fit on a specific displacement. And at that point, you know, 18-inch is the overlap because it's 2 increments above 15-inch for European powers. It's 2 inches up greater for US Navy and Japanese Navy designers who have now gotten used to going up in 2-inch increments. And then the Washington Treaty comes in and says, okay, everyone's doing 16-inch as the maximum. And of course, everyone therefore has to do the maximum. So short version, roughly speaking, a 1.5-inch increase in naval guns in the 1900s and 1910s is about the sweet spot for minimizing the overall cost of upgrade, but still getting a substantial increase in broadside firepower in terms of shot weight, penetration, and range. But if you have a year or two slack and you're watching with semi-disinterest from afar, well, you can just go a little half-inch extra, not huge amount increase in cost, but theoretically get better firepower for it and, you know, the smug face of having this slightly larger gun. Nathan Hong Sharon asks, The inefficiency of the Bismarck and Hipper is fairly obvious, but the Deutschland and Scharnhorst weren't that bad efficiency-wise. If perhaps in the mid-1920s, when they realised they're going to be making their pre-dreadnoughts replacements, someone at the Krupp factory had a brainwave and realised perhaps the screw breech would be a better compromise, and so later guns also benefited from this. How much bigger would Scharnhorst's design need to be to fit 3 triple screw breech 15-inch instead, since now they can also justify perhaps using slightly less armour and or speed? The French didn't think that 35,000 tons was possible with 3 triples, but the Scharnhorst dimensions compared to the King George V make it look doable to me. Well, it depends exactly how much this triple 15 is going to weigh, because we don't have that many actual triple 15s to compare it to, but we can look at the proportional increase in weight from, say, a twin 12-inch gun to a triple 12-inch gun, because that was done quite a few times. And then we can scale that from existing screw breech 15-inch guns like the 15-inch 42. And while the Italians do obviously have a triple 15-inch, it's a 15-inch 50. It's quite a substantial weapon. And I would say probably the Italian turret is the upper end of things, about 1,500 tons a turret. I think you probably could get that down a little bit, but let's say somewhere between 1,250 and 1,500 tons per turret. So let's ballpark it at, say, 1,350. So for that, for 3 turrets at 1,350 tons a turret, so you need just over 4,000 tons for the weight of the turrets themselves. Now, compared to the 1111s on the Scharnhorsts, that means we're immediately looking for about 1,800 tons. And of course, that's just the turret, so we're not looking at necessarily an increase in barbette armor. We're not looking at the increase in weight of the ammunition, the increase in weight of the ammunition hoists, and so on and so forth. Plus, we know that the Scharnhorsts were somewhat wet, somewhat overbalanced forward. They had the Atlantic bow fitted, but when Gneisenau was going to be refitted with twin 15s, they were going to have to insert a hull plug or extra bit of hull in her bow to get her to be, of the correct trim and flotation to support those guns. So overall, roughly speaking, I think when you look at all the additional changes you'd have to make to have triple 15s, you're probably searching for somewhere in the region of 2,500 to 3,000 tons, just in terms of increased weight of armament and related systems like the shell hoists and the magazines. That puts you up to around about 35,000 tons already standard displacement, not including any changes to the bow structure that you might need to make. So on the one hand, that's going to push you over the 35,000 ton treaty limit if you stick with the as designed armor layout, armor thickness, etc., and you don't want the ship to just immediately bury its nose in the sea. But on the other hand, if you switched to a more conventional all-or-nothing armor layout, that would save you some weight. And yes, you could potentially drop from 31 knots down to 28 knots, get rid of 1 or 2 of the boilers, and maybe use slightly smaller turbines. That, I think, would probably claw you back about enough weight that you could then actually get 3 triple 15s, on around about 35,000 tons. I mean, as we know, the British looked into this for the King George V's in one of the early iterations with 3 triple 15-inch 45 guns. Now, if the Germans insist on going with essentially the same size of gun, albeit with a screw breech as the Bismarcks had, so slightly longer ones, that might cause some issues, but in theory, the Scharnhorst would be a little less well protected than King George V's anyway. And between that and similar speed, I reckon you could probably just about fit that in on a somewhat lengthened and modified 35,000 ton Scharnhorst type hull. And finally for this week, I Feel Like a Curry asks, could a ship trying to make a fleeting escape from an adversary point all of its main armament aft, or as far aft as each turret will go, and coordinate the firing of the guns and thus gain any sort of speed boost? Very technically speaking, yes, but for all practical intents and purposes, no, because the amount of energy we're talking about is massively different in terms of orders of magnitude. So let's take, for example, a Yamato class, because that's got, you know, really heavy shells, even heavier than the super heavy shells that the Americans are using in the 16-inch 50s and so forth. Now, of course, Yamato has 2 triples up front and 1 triple aft, so she can only actually get optimum propulsion, if you like, by firing her triple 18.1 inch directly aft. The other 2 would have to bear as far back as they can, so you'd get some horizontal motion as well as forward motion. But if we just arbitrarily assume that for magical reasons all the forces are pointing directly back, because that simplifies the equations a little bit, the approximate kinetic energy of 70,000 tons, or 70 million kilograms, moving through the water at 27 knots, which is about 50 kilometers an hour, which is 13.9 meters per second, is about 6.7 billion joules. The sum total energy of 9 18.1 inch guns firing directly aft, if we take the muzzle velocity of the 18.1 inch shell and multiply up by the weight of the armor piercing shell and run the same kinetic energy equation, kinetic energy half mv squared, it's an impressive amount, 444 million joules, but it's an entire order of magnitude less. In fact, it's around about 1/15 of the energy required to move Yamato through the water. And as we know, the faster you go, the more energy you need on a near exponential level. So 1/15 of the energy, even if absolutely perfectly transmitted, and this is a hilariously poor analogy because we're assuming that all 3 turrets are firing directly aft and that every single bit of kinetic energy that the shells possess, obviously because for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, is being pushed back on Yamato rigidly and transmitted perfectly to the hull, which in reality isn't going to happen because obviously we've got the 2 front turrets not pointing perfectly aft. There's recoil compensators on the gun turrets, and even if there weren't, and if somehow magically if the guns were frozen in position and the gun mounts magically survived without the recoil compensation mechanisms, the transmission of that energy into the hull is still not going to be perfect because there's going to be an awful lot of distortion and tearing in the metal, even if everything doesn't immediately fly to pieces. But even in this utterly absurd, perfect world for the scenario, you would see a very, very momentary surge forward of maybe a fraction of a knot. And then, of course, the source of the energy disappears because the guns have been fired, and the ship would slow down again pretty much all the way pretty quickly. And in reality, what would happen is, yes, in theory, there would be a very, 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 very slight increase in speed, but it would be so negligible as to be lost in the clutter of, the second by second performance of the boilers, the rotation of the propellers, how much cavitation they've got, is the ship going up or down a wave, how bad are the waves, is the wind in their favor or not. All of these kind of things would actually make far more of an impact than firing all your guns aft as far as possible. And that wraps us up for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. If indeed you still are, you got to this point. And hopefully at some point later this month, now that I'm actually completely back on board and caught up after the Scandinavia trip and various other trips I've been doing, we will be able to follow on with stuff for, well, what's now past a little bit, but the 500,000 subscriber celebration. So thanks for sticking around, and hope to see you again in another video.